We're going to come back to America and live next year there. We'll build a house.
The history of that facility is one that we should not be forgetting about. Because if we forget what it was, we stand a chance of going down that same path again that led to what opened it.
I would like, a park or something like that. Yeah, beautiful land. Yeah, because I used to live about less than a mile, because I live in Crownsville Woods. I used to jog to the hospital and jog around, I love the area.
I would rather see them try to open Crownsville up again. I know I won't be working there, but you have so many people who actually need some mental health therapy. You really do.
Crownsville was built by the patients from Spring Grove. Maybe with an architect or a super, but basically the buildings were built by patients. And of course, you know that at that time, they wanted a hospital for the black people. And so they built Crownsville.
They made their own clothes, their own food. They lived in tents. They built those buildings with other contractors. They didn't get paid.
At that time, I thought of mental hospital as a place to leave the persons and forgot about them. The hospitals were located far away from urban centers. So it was no coincidence that Crownsville was located where it was, or Eastern Shore Hospital or Spring Hospital.
All the patients there were African American, so they were like people you would see in your own neighborhood sometimes. And sometimes you would wonder why they were there. But a lot now of the staff were white. But the staff was very integrated. The superintendent was white. A lot of the nurses were white. But the patients were all African American people.
A lot of blacks were there because they had nowhere else to go. They were indigent. That doesn't happen that much at a white hospital. Their families bring them in. They know what their problems are. They know what's going on. But these are people that are just scooped up off of the street, malnutrition, all kinds of things, mental disturbances.
And of course, the 20s and 30s, a lot of African Americans who were not psychiatric ill, but the community of Annapolis, or probably a few other places too, if they didn't like somebody, maybe he had committed a crime, but there wasn't some obvious stuff to convict him, you could send him to Crownsville.
The original history of Crownsville speaks to the fact that, things weren't good, and that we built this facility so we could put these people here where nobody would see them, and drunks were sent there, and patients were put there, and that was the last they were seen of.
And in those days, you'd have schizophrenic patients just walking kind of zombie-like along the wards, where what you'd see in the movies and whatever, because there was no other way you could treat them except with medications. Psychotherapy was tried, but it's pretty hard to. It never really worked that well for a fully psychotic patient.
Some of them condition was worse than others, So there have been times that, especially with your alcoholic patients, that they would have DTs. They would see things, and of course that was one of the symptoms of being an alcoholic, go through those withdrawals.
With the seizure patients, and never forget, work with them. Nurse had told me that the one thing about an epileptic, they like a lot of attention. So if you're giving attention to someone else, so they can fake a seizure just as normal as they were having one. So you have to be careful and treat it as a seizure.
I transferred all kinds of women, all kinds of men. Some were violent, some was, I would say tricky. They had something wrong with them. Yes, you had people that was homeless. You had people that had different diseases. During later years, they investigated and found that there were people that shouldn't have been in Crownsville. But they were there and they died there.
I did know some of them that would walk around the hospital grounds worked there, and they loved it. Had tractors and all kind of equipment to work with and to plow and do this. Also, a group of, I guess, about 15 or 20 of them got together. I guess the more better ones, or the ones who are more capable of doing things, got together and had a little group that they had a little stand, and they sold some of the stuff. They used to have farms, patients go out there and work and raise stuff and raise enough food for themselves.
There's racks in there. When they used to be a farm, they would actually take the livestock after they've prepared it to be hung and everything, and there's on the back docks, you can see where they hung them on the hooks, and that's where they would take and cut the poultry up and cut the cows, the pork, so forth. And I've actually seen old pictures where it told you how to cut them up. They still had them on the wall. They still had the old meat scale that sat in there for weighing out, and it was quite large of a scale. And today that building is the, I believe, Illinois County Food Bank.
Before the Second World War, psychiatry, especially in the state hospitals, was very primitive, but also because, as I mentioned before, the lack of personnel and so forth. I am convinced, and I heard, but I have no proof that they did lobotomies. What they did is they would take a sharp knife, stick it in here, and go like that. So, and you have to realize that, the thinking and active brain that we have are the frontal lobes that make us human, but also can make us mentally ill. The ones that got lobotomies, in my experience, the ones that I saw in the other hospitals, had been very violent, usually very violent, and they got the lobotomies. I'm sure that they didn't cross. There's no doubt in my mind at all.
From its inception, there was some inhumane treatment of clients at Crownsville Hospital Center. And they were not treated with any dignity or respect at all. They were warehoused there. There was a lot of racist issues that were going on with those clients as well.
We know for a fact that whites look at blacks differently in terms of the medical field. So if you go through the history of Crownsville and you go through the medical journals and listen to how white doctors classify African Americans, overwhelmingly, they say that African Americans have mental deficiencies because they were not able to handle freedom after emancipation. That's ludicrous.
I remember walking through those doors. I was handcuffed. And they gave you like a bag lunch, and then from that point, they put you in a sort of like jumpsuit, and they place you on a ward where it's like a big room where everybody else is at. And there was others there like me that just had been put in between a rock and a hard place, basically drug addict mothers or, fathers was dead and didn't have no family. All they wanted to do was drug us up, to have us where they could do anything, say anything, treat us any kind of way. Some of them staff would punch you, kick you, put you in that room just to put you in that room. It was sort of like we call it the black hole, the pit. It was cold. They had one that was just a metal door, 4 walls, and cold room. No padding, no nothing. At that time, it was devastating to me because not knowing who my mother was, not knowing, who my father really was, having my Aunt Maria and my grandmother was like my safe haven. And to not wake up and see them or not be able to reach out to them, it crushed me.
Shock treatment was still being used at the hospital at that time. It was still considered to be a very good treatment. And even to today, it's making a resurgence for being considered good treatment for very, very severely psychotic, depressed patients. And yes, it was used then. I myself at least used it about, I would say, 6 times in my career there as a resident.
Well, they would hook the electric things on you and put tapes on them, and then they'd hit the switch, and when they hit the switch, the patient would go, really, and then, of course, they'd turn it right off, and they'd do it about 3 or 4 times, and then they'd put him in a bed, and he'd come to, and And it was hard on them, I'm sure. Once they got the shock, they would come, you know, very unstable. They would know nothing. But I don't think it helped.
On the day shift, they had a shock ward. And the patients didn't want to take shock. And I said, well, do they have to take shock? And they be crying, I'll be crying, but yeah, they had an area set up for them with the bed and the electronic equipment and all of that. We had 3 people. I never held the head, but they do. One held the head, one held one arm, and one foot. And I always, you know, held an arm, and I was rubbing petting, always had an arm. Screaming, they were like crying, you know, resistant. They had a mouth guard, no, they couldn't yell or anything. And they were cooperative, but they didn't want to have it, but they didn't, you know, I was upset because like they didn't have a choice. And I had to participate in them getting a choice, you know.
When shock treatment was used, and I'm sure it was used in Crownsville very extensively, but I'm talking, I would think, 20s, 30s, 10s, 50s, maybe 40s. They would give 20, 30, 40 shock treatments, and the patients would end up with brain damage. That was another thing. At the moment, if a person is given 12 shock treatments, that is about the absolute upper limit. The first antipsychotic drug, thorazine, was started in about the late 50s. And before that, they had basically sedatives. Bromides, they had some benzodiazepines, sleeping pills. In fact, one of the most effective medications were narcotics. But when the laws changed about opium, then they couldn't use the narcotics anymore for that.
Dr. Addie Emo is an African. Dr. Addie Emo do not believe in giving people sedatives before he do any surgery or anything on anybody. I saw a woman pull her tongue out of her head. He took the methylate. Methylate has the skeleton bones, the skeleton head on it with the X. He poured that in that woman's mouth and just went on and sewed her tongue back in her head. That was Dr. Amo.
I was committed to Crownsville with my father on July 7th, 1976. I wasn't sick, I was having fantasies. So my mother said, Dr. Goodman wants you to take these pills. Well, it was thorazine. And I learned thorazine, it hypes me up. It doesn't calm me down. So they took me down to the hospital. I was given an injection of thorazine. They took me home. The cops said he'll be asleep in 10 minutes. I was out there trying to kickstart my motorcycle. Took me back down to the hospital, different doctor, another 100 units of thorazine. I got up and walked out of the hospital. 6 police officers came after me. And they said, you're coming back inside. I said, I'm not going anywhere. And I laid down on the sidewalk, and they picked me up and put me on their shoulders. And I like to say they carried me to my death. I had 18% brain damage, and they gave me so much thorazine. After I ran out of the hospital, they carried me back in, they strapped me down to a gurney. You know, my father came in, and I said, why are they doing this to me? And he said, they're not doing it, I'm doing it. He committed me to Crownsville, my own father. I was taken by ambulance to Crownsville. This time, the 3 pills and the 2 injections were really starting to work on me. They opened the door, they opened another door, and here I'm in the loony bin where all the crazy ones would come. I said, where am I? And the cop said, you're home. And I literally, I swear to God, thought I had died and gone to hell.
Well, they'd give you this little cup, and you'd have little pills in there, and you'd have some water to drink with it. If you had liquid medication, you had to, make sure that, you swallowed it right in front of them to know that you'd taken it right. Some people, they just loaded them up with medication and let them sit there and vegetate, It's very easy to slip into a place you never come out of. There were plenty of people that happened to. I saw that happen to them in Crownsville, over the years I was there.
They came around with these little white, little cups, and with always with a container of like orange juice, and they'd have to eat these pills and drink the orange juice. I don't know what they gave me, if it was the same as them, but they gave it to me. I remember initially it really made me thirsty all the time, and I felt real slow and sluggish, and I just didn't feel good. I just always wanted to lay down somewhere.
They would lock you in this room, and if you didn't want to go in a room, all of them would grab you and rush you, hold you down, restrain you, as they say, and force you to take it, either by mouth or by a needle. And that's how I was overdosed. Yeah, they gave me Ritalin, and they gave me something called thorazine. And the thorazine, I learned later on in life that was an injection they used to put horses to sleep with.
If you cried, they gave you a shot. If you laughed out loud, they gave you a shot. If you yelled, they gave you a shot. And if you didn't do anything, they gave you a shot. It was needle hay. They gave shots out left and right, left and right. And I'm talking orderlies who are like 6'4" and 275 pounds holding you down or a needle in your butt.
When I started working in the hospital, we still use the straitjacket. It was maybe about a year after I went over there that they abolished the straitjacket. But we had patients that we had to put in straitjackets.
There were times that were very intense with whatever level of patient, where sometimes they would have to be restrained. And we were all trained to do that. There were levels of restraint. If a patient was a harm to themselves or others, there were chemical restraints, which was kind of the last thing, but you would talk first, and then there were places where patients would need to be physically restrained. There were chairs where they would be physically restrained, and everybody knew how to do it because it was the only way to be safe. It was the only way to keep the person safe and to keep you as staff safe.
I remember the first time it happened, they had stripped me down, and they put me in this type of tie-up thing to where I was like this. Yeah, I was like this. And then they put me in this room, and the room had like mattresses glued or tied to the walls and on the floor. And some of the rooms had buckets in it, and some of the rooms just had a hole in the floor. And that's what you would use for the bathroom if you needed to use the bathroom. There was no toilet paper or water or anything like that in there, but.
Above all else, they hated the seclusion room. They sometimes called it the nightmare chamber, but mostly they just called it the chamber or the room. And you could be put into seclusion for anywhere from a couple hours to a couple of days. If you were there for more than 8 hours, you're supposed to get a bucket for your bathroom needs, but sometimes the orderly forgot to put the bucket in the room. And it seemed like the seclusion room could be used somewhat unpredictably and somewhat indiscriminately. The patients never knew from one day to the next what would or would not earn them a trip to the chamber.
I was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring out the window, waiting for Jesus to come and save me. And 4 of them jumped me, 4 orderlies jumped me, dragged me down the hall, dragged me into a room, raped me, kicked me in the groin 5 or 6 times, ripped my shirt off. The necklace that my wife made me as a wedding present, which didn't have a clasp. It was all one piece. They broke that off. They pulled my pants down, left me laying in my underwear, and locked the door.
In the 20s, I mean, there was discrimination. Patients, as you will hear from different people, were used for research. And of course, they weren't considered equal by any means in the 20s and 30s, probably into the 40s. They were not considered equal by any means, so it was a common thing, probably not just for Crownsville Hospital, but for many people to be used as research objects, for lack of a better word.
Back when, there were things happening to people from an experimental thing. That's where I got it. Experimenting on something. Or give somebody a test and they cover the face up and next thing you know, they're gone. Nobody would check.
They were having me, it was me and another person. We would go to these places where there was already a stone there, and they would have, we would dig the dirt out until we reached a box or wood there. And then they would throw these. You ever been to like a hospital facility where they have these big bags that they put laundry in? Well, they were big, these big laundry bags tied off at the end, and they would put them in there. I mean, then there was another place that we went to that there was a whole lot of them, a whole lot of those things there. Some of them had names on them too. I remember some of them having names. And then there were some places that was like behind the farm area that didn't have any stones at all. They were just holes.
Well, I was in a place, and I was wrong for doing it, but it fascinated me, and I broke a lock off it and went in there and knocked over these containers they had, what they had in there, children's brains. You could say brains, I could see on television brains, but I had it in a solution, but I heard something and I went to jump around and I knocked the things over on the floor. And one hit the other parts of women. That's what I saw.
Governor McKeldin was the governor of Maryland then, and he evidently was out there. He came out, I guess it was so bad or something, and I'm sure the state police, that were assigned to him brought him out. And I remember people talking about that he actually came out there because of that riot was so bad and all, and they had held employees hostage.
We had a gate man on the top floor where the cell blocks are, and someone goofed somewhere and the patients were let out of the cell block and came through the whole C building, got past the gate on the top floor and came down. There were 103 patients in the dining room, and it was only me and another guy. First thing I know, trays were flying and chairs were flying. Some of the patients were hiding. Someone hit me in the head with a leg to an oak chair that had metal braces on it. My head was cut open and my fingers were cut and I had marks on my hands. They took me to the nurse's home. Anyway, they backed us down the hallway and we were bleeding. We had blood running down our clothing. Then they let us go. They took the other guy's keys. We got into the bedroom and sat in there for what seemed like a long time before the fire whistle ever sounded. There was a medicine room up on the next floor, and we heard glass breaking, and they got into the medication room. We sat in that room bleeding, and finally they came in and got us and took those people to jail. They carried us over to the nurses' home. I stayed in there for 2 days and took off for 4 weeks, went home, and then came back again. I had trouble with my wrist, so they x-rayed it again, and it wasn't broken, but it sure hurt. My fingers were cut from the metal on the chair leg. Yeah, I had to protect my face because they were hitting us. I was knocked out. There was a gate man sitting there watching everything, but he couldn't let anyone out. They took the supervisor and threw him down the stairway. He had cuts on his face and head. He was hurt bad.
I said, God, get me out of here. I grabbed the metal bar, the bars that go around the windows, put my foot against the wall, stuck my fingers inside of it, said, God, please, and I broke the deadbolt in half. And I was gonna dive through the window. I said, wait a minute, you're not that crazy. I locked the window, opened it, climbed out the window, looked to the left, there was buildings, looked to the right, there was farms. I went to the right in my underwear. So here I am walking down Crownsville Road. I busted a watermelon open and ate. I heard some water running, so I drank. And then I'm walking down Crownsville Road, and the guard pulled up to get in the car, and I said, no. And he said, well, Dr. Perez wants to see you. I want to take it home. So I got in the car, went back. He opened the door. 6 guys dragged me. I got away from him. I ran over to where my bed was, which was the last bed on the right-hand side of the back. I flipped it over. They climbed over the bed. They grabbed me. They beat me mercilessly. Gave me an injection of thorazine and put me back in the seclusion room.
It was a Christmas party, and I was with this wonderful music therapist I work with at Crownsville, and we were leaving. So the patients are usually transported on a bus, and we were getting on the bus to go. And this is a patient who'd been in several times, and he ran off. He ran from the bus. He just flew. And we had 30 patients loading on the bus. Mary Alice and I saw him flying away, and we started to run after him, but he was gone. So we got in our car. So we saw that he turned down 450, and we followed him, and he wouldn't stop. So we just followed him. He finally stopped on the side of the road, and he ran up the road. We pulled the car over and parked the car and got out. He knew both of us. We both worked with him quite a bit, and we didn't run after him, but he had stopped, and he was by a tree, and he kept saying, leave me alone. I don't want to come back. I'm ready to go. I'm not coming back. And so we just talked to him and said, you know, it's a winter time. We're really concerned. We don't want you outside. You don't even have much of a coat on, and what's going on? And we gradually got closer to him. Is it okay if we come closer to you? You know, we really want to take you back. And he finally relented, but he struggled a little bit when we got up to him, and then he walked back to the van and we came back to the hospital.
We just started beating them up, grabbed their keys and got out the door. It was a whole week. We ate berries, you know, we tried to get in people's houses and get food and water and clothes and whatever we could get. I walked and I walked till my feet got to hurting. I was thirsty, I was hungry. Out of 7 kids broken out of the facility, I made it all the way home.
When patients would wander away, usually they would just go down the road to the nudist colony, which I believe is still there, but they knew it was there, and they'd walk off and they'd find the fence around it because they knew it was there. We had a patient who walked. He was argumentative. He was young. He was younger than most of the other patients, and he also had schizophrenia, and he walked away from the building in like July, and we couldn't. He actually died out like a mile away from the cottage, and he was out because with schizophrenics, their internal thermostat doesn't work. So it was July, and he had sweatpants and a winter jacket on. And he was gone for about a month, and they found him like a mile away from the. It was horrible. It was like the most horrible thing that ever happened there.
I was attending the University of Maryland. I felt like everything was coming apart. I lost my ability to concentrate. I was trying to go to class, and not, and of course my thinking was just getting wild. I don't know exactly what was said and when, but one fine day, on the last day of the month in March 1965, the 31st of March, I found myself in the back seat of my mother's Chevy Nova. She's driving the car. My father's in the passenger seat. I didn't know exactly where we're going, but I knew something was up. And it wasn't a real long ride, but came on this big campus-like thing. We ended up going down. It's just kind of a short road that goes right through the place. And then you make a right-hand turn, and on the left, you'll see this one-story building, more modern than the rest of Meyer building. And that was to be my home for many months to come. Later on, they decided to take the entire population of that ward and move them over to the C building. And I remember we'd go downstairs to the mess hall, and they had shifts where they'd bring 4 people in, and they'd be finishing up as we were brought in. And I remember the poor women standing there. So they were so bad off, they were actually just pooping on the floor. I mean, that's something I never quite got out of my head. I don't think anybody ever sat down with me and said, Stephen, it's the 3rd damn time you've been here. What are we going to do about it? We can't have you keep coming back. Nothing was discussed like that. Nothing was attempted to wake me up and put the fear of God in me or whatever it was. It was kind of like, as it turned out, it was up to me. I had to make the decision somehow. And I don't know when I made it, but maybe by that 3rd time, before I got out, I started getting an inkling of what the hell is going on here. This is the 3rd friggin' time I'm here. I may never get out of this place. And I'd barely been in there for maybe a few weeks, I suppose. But they had given me some ground privileges. Well, one fine afternoon, I was back behind the Meyer building and the field. There was a field behind the building, led right up to the road. So I started walking up to there, and I knew that was Crownsville Road that led into Annapolis. I found myself up near the Annapolis Mall after a while, and I started thumbing right. So one trip led to another, and by God, within about 2 hours maybe at tops, I was down there at the campus of the University of Maryland. And I'm sitting there talking to him in his room, my best buddy, and the campus police walked in. They said, I think it was Mr. Sunday, something, Steve, we're very concerned about you. Could you come along? So they put me in the police car on the campus and turned me over to state police, I believe. I got in the state trooper's car, and they drove me all the way back to Crownsville. My own contention is it's not just the hospital. You have to have people that love you enough that won't let you go down there and disappear. They'll fight. My mother, father, they didn't let that happen, and I love them for that. And for some reason at 70, it's kind of hard to keep my eyes dry about things. I felt myself tearing up quite a bit about things, But I like that. I like to be able to cry about things. Because it means life means something to you.
That right outside of our canteen, we had a condom machine. So we knew they were having sex because that machine was always empty. And I went in one day, and the fella was getting condoms out of the machine, and he was so embarrassed. He turned in. I said, "Don't be embarrassed for me." It was on, because my day was on Friday. I said, "You were planning a big weekend." So I just made it into a joke so he wouldn't feel so bad about it, you know. When the lights went out, a lot of stuff happened, like in any other place, you know. So, I mean, so he was getting those condoms. He was planning to use them that night, I guess.
They'd catch somebody every once in a while, you know. Especially bad with the teenagers, you know, they had the adolescent unit, and they were glands flowing already. And it was always an issue there, I know.
What would go on would be certain people could reach a level where they could go outside. And there's a lot of trees and a lot of bushes. And sex went on constantly every day on the grounds.
When I was a little girl, my brother had a terrible habit of running in and out of the house and up and down the porch and slamming doors. And my mother was in the kitchen cooking dinner, and she yelled at me and she said, "Chanda, go out there on the porch and tell your brother either to stay on the porch or get off the porch, but I'm tired of hearing that door slam." And then she said, "Wait a minute, I'm gonna go tell him myself." And when she walked out onto the porch, there were two patients in the midst of being intimate, and she screamed and they both jumped up and ran, and she shut the door and locked it and was stunned and said, "I'm so glad I didn't send you out on that porch." And then of course called security, and I'm sure they were rounded up and scolded.
Well, let's put it this way. I don't know of any lesbian couples, but there was a lot of homosexuality going on the wards. A lot. I say a lot, you know. I mean, it wasn't as open as it is today, but you know, there was homosexual acts going on, especially at night on the wards.
There was excessive homosexuality. The guys would crawl into the beds and do their thing. And I was in the shower one day, and three black guys tried to rape me in the shower. And they held my face against the shower head. And Mr. Braxton, thank God, Mr. Braxton came in and caught him and stopped before anything happened. The next day, they were transferred off to a ward. But to this day, I have to stand backwards to the shower because I can't stand to have water hit me in the face. I have flashbacks.
This doctor, we were talking to different patients, and there was one lady, and he just shook his head. He says, "She is having sex with the male patients for a nickel." That's what, a nickel. So, but, you know, to these people had nothing, and nickel, you know, you do it 3 or 4 times, and you got enough a pack of cigarettes, you know?
It had to be confidential, except that we would witness these patients having sex in a bathroom or something like that, and we couldn't tell the patient that wasn't HIV positive that this person was. Yeah, this is what we had just caught them doing, you know. We'd call a code, and a code would mean that staff would come to break this happening up.
People are people.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's a basic human need. So the official story was, you know, sex was discouraged between patients. And at the same time, they had condoms dispensers on the wall. So basically, you know, people are people, and we know people are going to do what they're going to do. It wasn't encouraged by any means, but, you know, we all know what human nature is. So certainly, it was, you know, sex between patients. What you don't want the situation to develop, and that's why it was discouraged, is that somebody doesn't take advantage of somebody else for certain, you know, I mean, some women would have sex for a cigarette. I mean, that was, you know, part of the economy there was cigarettes.
We just basically tell patients in terms of finding boyfriends and girlfriends, when you come to the mental hospital, our goal for you is not to find a husband or a wife or a girlfriend or a boyfriend, because when you're mentally ill, you may not be making the best choices, and having a mental illness is a serious thing. And so our goal is for you to get stable so that when you leave, you can work on finding a partner. But we did provide condoms. So it was sort of it's like, well, why would you give us condoms? But two people with a mental illness having a baby, the chances of that child having a mental illness skyrocket. So we would provide condoms.
As a child, I came up in a dysfunctional family, and there was times where they just didn't want to have to deal with me, and I was often locked in the closet and often tied up. It happened to be one day that the police came with social service, and all I had on was a pair of underwear, tied up, hog-tied. Hog-tied is if you're on your stomach and you have rope on your ankles and your hands, and you're behind, and both of them are tied together to where you're like almost like in a semicircle on your stomach, and that's being hog-tied. And we went to this place in Crownsville, and we went to the Meyer building. And I remember sitting there waiting, and the reason I remember is because they brought us something to eat. It was dinner, and it was the first time I ever remember having Navy beans. I was kind of glad to get away because, you know, not only was that going on, but my mom was doing things with me that weren't right. Thought it was what people did. I didn't want to do it to nobody. But I guess I wasn't old enough to want to then. I just remember being trapped in the bathroom a couple times when I went in there to use the bathroom. I had sexual encounters. I had people force themselves on me a few times there. I thought it was something people did because my mom did it to me.
My mother was a patient at Crownsville. I knew that she was fine, and then a few months out of the year, I knew she was a whole different person. Well, she walked down the street to someone's house, took off all of her clothes, and got in their car, and sat there and said she was waiting for this man that she always thought was coming to get her to come and pick her up. It's funny because this man that she had this memory of was a man who raped her when she was 18, and that was her first nervous breakdown. But the one time that I really remember was she was admitted overnight. It was a court order type thing like usual. She went to the C building. We got a call, and I say the middle of the night. It was dark. And there was an accident. She was hurt. They didn't give a lot of details. They said she was attacked. We go in, and they brought my mother down, and it was horrifying to see her. She was in a hospital gown, and her face was swollen and blue and bleeding. She had blood running down her legs. She was visibly beaten, and she was crying, and my father said, "Oh my God, what happened?" And she said, "That man raped me." And my father said, "What?" And she pointed to a man. She said, "That man right there. Why did he do that to me?" And a fight. My father went after the man. It was just very chaotic. I don't even remember. I just remember my father going after him and people jumping on my father and pulling him off and him screaming at people. And it ended. My mother went in an ambulance to be checked out. And, they did an examination of her, and she was raped. When you think of someone helping the mentally ill, for me, I think of some therapeutic. I think of someone nurturing. I think of somebody wanting to take care of you and help. And that's not the feeling you got from Crownsville.
Before George Phillips, it was basically a racist hospital. Because it was all white staff, basically, and no black staff. So I would say the patients would probably, the black patients would have been probably better treated by Dr. Phillips and his staff as opposed to before. Was it run well then? I don't know, maybe they put the powers to be who were all Caucasians, basically. It was a well-run hospital because we kept all the niggas in the same place and they were all mentally ill.
You know, the first black staff member came in 1948. We don't get our first black superintendent until 1964 and 65. And he was a community person, and he believed that the whole family was responsible for getting a person well. But the numbers, my understanding is the numbers grew slowly because there were other places to go. And Crownsville had a stereotype as the Negro hospital. And that was in the first place a white person was going to take their family member.
When I first went to work there in April of '62, and my first day at Crownsville was my parents' 25th wedding anniversary, so I always could remember, you know, each. And but it was still hadn't been integrated yet. And I mean, the staff had. I understand there was a time when all the staff was white and the patients were all black. But I think they integrated in maybe October or November of that same year. But you know, it was really a while before you. I mean, it was slow. It was a while before you saw white patients. And the families of white patients raised a bit of a ruckus when their white family members, you know, were going to Crownsville because Crownsville had this history of being a solely black institution, you know.
Dr. Phillips had quite a few sons, about 2 or 3 daughters, you know. But there was this one son who was a drug addict, you know, and that wasn't right. But if they would call around the hospital, there was extra staff that they felt they did not need, then that staff would have to go up on that hill and sit with Dr. Phillips' drug addict son. And there wasn't nothing in the protocols that said that, you know, we had to do it, but we had to, you know what I'm saying? Because it was Dr. Phillips' son. I had to go, you know, and sit up there for 8 hours with the son. And then at 11:30, another staff member that was working the night shift came from some early to sit. And it sat with him, I guess until he became detoxified, I guess. He would sit there sometimes, he was so out of it. He would sit up there masturbating and all that. But we had to sit there when it was hard to be on the ward, you know what I mean?
I was familiar with his son's band, Orlando, his guitar player. He was in the band, it's called Lucindiana. He was hooked on PCP. He was hooked on Coast Constant.
We had an incident together that I never could forget in some respects. I remember one day that I was taking care of a patient in C building. I was doing my work, really, and the patient had a seizure and on the floor. And I started to attend to the patient, and I was asking for things like the tongue bleeds at the time, which that was the treatment then. They didn't have it, and I was asked, I lost it, and I criticized the hospital and said, what kind of a hospital is this at all? You don't have medical equipment for something simple as trying to deal with a patient who's having a seizure. All I know is, like, the next morning, I was in the house, and him and an administrator who was a lawyer, George, I call him George Phillips, knocked on my door, and I said, come on in. It was like early morning before I started going in to even get to go. I might have been in my pajamas, and my wife, he brought the guy in, and he lambasting me for criticizing his hospital for not having equipment. So I said, that's exactly what I did. I said I did it, and I didn't plan to take it back because I'm pretty stubborn myself sometimes. So he told me not to have that happen again, and I got the sense that he was kind of a little threatening me a little bit.
If Phillips came to see you were in trouble, you were going into seclusion, if you said anything about her bad, and he heard about it, you were going into seclusion, and you were going to stay there for a week. And you were lucky she got bread and water. The best man at my wedding, sister told me that he kept cracking on her, making comments, touching her, and stuff like that. And she said, well, he does that with all the nurses.
We didn't really get into the rumors of whatever sexual escapades might have gone on there because A, they weren't provable, and B, the standard of the time, which unfortunately has changed a bit in journalism, but the standard of the time was that if it wasn't affecting your public job, then it wasn't really public knowledge. Or if he was having an affair with somebody, we didn't really much care. Things have changed a little bit in journalism since then, but you know, how much of the neglect that I witnessed did Dr. Phillips foster or sanction or encourage, or how much of it was just the legacy of the place that he couldn't fix even if he wanted to? We'll never know. One of the complaints about Dr. Phillips was that he wasn't around enough. In fact, he had 2 jobs with the state health department. One is head of Crownsville, the other is, I think, the regional superintendent of mental health. Plus, he worked, he moonlighted at the Social Security Administration for 16 to 20 hours a week. Plus, he had his own private practice. Plus, he was, according to the time records we found, absent for long stretches of time. And so there was a real question about how much time he was really there and really available. His time card said that he came in on weekends and that he indeed, you know, put in his 40 hours or whatever it was a week, but certainly other hospital administrations said, oh, Dr. Phillips isn't here.
When it all came to a bubble and he brought him up on charges, he had a heart attack. Dr. Phillips had a heart attack, and the doctor said the trial would kill him. It was all flushed under the table. Nothing was done. He faked it.
He faked it?
To keep having to go to trial for all the atrocities he allowed to go on in Crownsville.
The state legislature convened an investigation with the blessing of the governor, and they held hearings. At one point, almost a year later, I think, one of the committees recommended that Crownsville be studied to be closed, which prompted the superintendent at the time, George Phillips, to have an emotional reaction about that and proclaiming that it was all part of a grand conspiracy against him personally.
A lot of the times that staff were injured was during a seclusion or restraint. If a patient became hostile and assaultive, you had to lay hands on them. There were prescribed ways to do that. There was training that was done all the time. Every single staff person who worked on those wards had to be trained in how to take down a patient safely. But if you can imagine, someone who is psychotic at the moment has adrenaline flowing through their body. They're very difficult to manage. So if you've tried to talk them down into a less agitated state, but it hasn't worked, and they become assaultive and you have to lay hands on. Again, that's where the injuries happen, the injuries to the patient and the injuries to the staff.
Well, you would get a person in, let's say, from the emergency room. He did all sort of crazy things. He you know, he was hallucinating, he was delusional, he thought that the FBI was after him, let's say, but the FBI included also the local police and the fire department, and maybe people that walked the streets that had a hat on, or a raincoat like you see on the movies, what FBI people looked like 50 years ago. And they might become aggressive. You know, there came this man with this hat on, and he started, what are you going after me, how? And so forth. And then they called the police, and the police took him to the emergency room. The emergency room, he was evaluated by a psychiatrist in the emergency room and sent to our hospital. That was the most common.
When we were admitting patients one night, I was out in the admission suite area helping, and I was with the social worker, and we had 2 or 3 patients to be admitted that particular evening. We had a large book in the admissions out there where we would record the patient and a lot of information about them. And I remember bending over to write on this table. I wasn't sitting at a desk. I was bent over backward to, or forward to the, and the patient came up behind me and had a leather strap that I was not aware of that he even had in his belongings. And he put it around my neck. And he was trying to choke me, and he actually threw me to the floor. I was somehow able to get a couple of screams out so that actually the physician didn't come out. It was the patient that the physician was admitting who actually came out to help me. And I think my screaming in the presence of them, the patient that was trying to choke me actually released the leather strap so that I could, you know, get up and be okay. It did leave marks around my neck.
They called me to come in for an interview and what have you. Okay, I'll go in for this interview. Oh my goodness. I said, oh. When they took me down to show me some areas where, you know, you will be working and the type of patients you'll be working with, I said, oh my Lord, I don't know if I can stay in this or not. Things I saw that you don't see every day. Okay, for instance, I saw a lady with a mouse in her mouth, the tail part hanging out, and a trickle of blood going down on this side. I saw that. She was eating the mouse. Another thing that I saw, oh my goodness, there was this lady who wanted to make her hair grow, and every time someone would go in the bathroom, she would go in the bathroom behind them and take their feces and rub it in her hair to try to make her hair grow. Okay, you asked me, I'm telling you. These were some of the things that I saw. I saw a lady eating her own sanitary pad. The ladies, to me, were worse than the men.
There were many disturbed patients there. Some with schizophrenia. Some days they were very kind and sweet to you, and other days they had to be restrained because they would attack you. You know, they were constantly, you know, they would have trouble with the men running in the women's quarters and the women running in the, you know, sometimes they would disclothe.
Some of the violent issues can be from brain-injured patients, because when you get a brain injury, this part of your brain is your frontal cortex, and what happens there is it deals with thinking, memory, impulse control. So some of these people are sexually inappropriate, so they take their clothes off. No good reason, and then they feel like taking their clothes off. And their ability to sort of think things through and appreciate the idea that if I lose my cool and hurt somebody, it's just going to keep me here longer.
This patient approached me, I never forget. Roberta Fawley, I don't know where she is. If she's still living, I know she's in Jessup. For the women, not Clifton T. And she came to the office door, and she covered the whole door. And she said, how would you feel? Reach back and pull out this butcher knife if I cut your damn head off. Well, I said, well, I wouldn't have any feelings at all. I said, you would have the feelings, but I'm sure I would be dead. She said, I was just testing you out. She said, don't worry. She said, you'll be safe here.
It still makes you wonder.
And I was so glad when it came time for me to get out of there and go to my nursing class. Oh, yeah.
We had one patient, Christmas Eve, destroyed a complete three-stall bathroom, trying to eat a bar of soap. Who wants to let someone put a bar of soap in their mouth? But on the other hand, when they're that combative, the only thing you can do is step back until you get the proper amount of people together to be able to go in and sedate and subdue this patient properly. They would sedate the patient. They would in turn put them in a straitjacket and then isolate them in order to not have other patients disturbed or riled up.
You have to start with the simplest thing, you know, like talking to them, try to calm them down, offer medication, you know, offer quiet room, you know, so they can, and increase, you know, like it could be restraint or seclusion. If a patient try to bite you, you know, if they bite you, you have to push against their mouth, you know, because if it's the other way, they will grab, you know, the piece of flesh from you. If they are pulling your hair, you know, to keep their hands on your hair. If you are going to grab some patients that, you know, that are very, very, you need somebody else, you know, to grab them in a way so they will not hurt you and you will not hurt them either.
And this happened when I was in the med-surg building there, working evening shift. And I'm not quite sure why the patient in particular was a patient in our building at that time, but he was suicidal. And when he was in the cottage that he was typically in, he was known to be just run down the hall and bang his head into the wall as hard as he could. That was typical behavior for him. We had him in our building. He was suicidal, and he was on one-to-one monitoring. So there was a nurse or an aide assigned to be with him at all times. For whatever reason, the aide left him for a couple of minutes to go get something. And in that quick time, the patient left the building through a window. We had no locks on our windows or anything. Left the building, and we were looking for him, you know, immediately. Couldn't find him. Within 5 minutes of his leaving, all of the lights in the building flashed, and we didn't know what that was. He had gone down the hill from our building and jumped into the electrical power plant that was there and grabbed a hold of 2 live wires. I have no idea of the voltage that went through it now, but at any rate, when they brought him back to our building, he couldn't talk. He was actually just babbling, and his shoes had been knocked off, his pants burned, his t-shirt was burned. We transferred him via helicopter, I believe, that evening to the burn unit in Baltimore, and it so happens that that patient recovered, and that patient was discharged from that facility to live a normal life after that shock from that power plant.
In 1975, the Evening Capital was then, and I hope it is still today, a very scrappy newspaper. It was unafraid to look into the dark corners of the community. And we had heard rumors about Crownsville. It was always this sort of mysterious place right outside of Annapolis. The grounds looked nice from the outside. You didn't see a lot of activity there. There wasn't a lot of community involvement. And yet you heard rumors that this was not a particularly nice place, that this was not a good place, that nasty things went on. I was pacing around my apartment in Annapolis trying to figure out, okay, this is a story, but we don't quite have it. How can we get this story? And it came to me that I ought to check in. I ought to become a patient there, secretly. so that it wouldn't be a staged event. In the summer of 1975, around in late afternoon on a Friday, one of the editors of the Annapolis Evening Capital took me down to Crownsville, and we sort of knocked on the door, and he said, well, this kid here is talking about killing himself, and I'm worried about him. And with very, very minimal effort, I was admitted to Crownsville Hospital. The first thing that happened when I was there, I was escorted over to this metal caged central area, which is the nurses' station. And the woman handed me a cup of yellow liquid and said, drink this. And I said, well, she said, I really don't want to drink anything. And she said, that's too bad, drink it anyhow. And once you've drunk it, open your mouth to show me that you've swallowed it. And it was Melril, which was a very strong antipsychotic drug, a tranquilizer in the family that's used on horses, actually. And within 90 minutes, I was exhausted. I was tired, I was sleepy, I was lethargic. All I wanted to do was do exactly what the other 20 men were doing there, which was lay down somewhere. Crownsville was not a hospital where people were treated for illness. It was not, at that time, a place where people were cared for. It wasn't even a place where people were cared about. It was a locked prison with grates on the windows and locked steel doors. And instead of the iron shackles that had been used in Crownsville's dark past, it was chemical shackles. It was tranquilizers that made the patients, or inmates more accurately, tired and drowsy and lethargic and compliant and easily ignored by the staff there. It was a place where patients came and were drugged and forgotten. There was in the week that I was there was no therapy that I saw. There was no treatment that I saw, other than being lined up three times a day and being given drugs. And it was a shame. I never got out. I never got out to exercise during that week. There were hours and hours and hours that would go by in the ward where nobody said anything. They were too drugged. There were many cases where people didn't get released from the hospital and became, in the medical jargon of the time, institutionalized. And I saw a lot of those. These were men who had spent years and years and years inside, and they had become so beaten down and drugged down that they just shuffled from day to day. That there was practically nothing in their lives. They were dressed in whatever shabby sort of institutional clothes were given to them. They said nothing to anybody. They in some cases, they might have mumbled to themselves, but they were old and sad cases. One morning, a nurse set out a single razor blade and a bowl of water for everyone to shave from. Several old, feeble men asked her to shave them. They distrusted their own unsteady hands. She began the duty, but lost interest by the second patient. She ordered another patient, an erratic man who raved about wartime combat, to shave the older patient. He began, but also lost interest and dropped the blade. The old man sat unnoticed for several minutes, half-shaven with white cream covering his face. He slowly picked up the blade and hesitatingly rubbed it across his face. A large cut appeared, bleeding profusely. Since he had no mirror, he continued, badly slashing his ear. The blood mixed with the white shaving cream as he jerked the razor around. The nurses were oblivious. So I was discharged after 6 days there, and we went on to do more than 50 interviews. We went back to the hospital. I went back to the hospital as a reporter. We had Norman Goldberg, who was a very good photographer, went back, took photographs, and we did what today is an ungodly long series of stories in the Evening Capital, 18 parts, that looked at Crownsville, and only part of those stories were based on my experience. The rest was based on very traditional reporting. We looked at the budgets, which of course Crownsville always said were insufficient. We looked at the staffing, which was certainly very, very below par. We looked at whatever documentation we could have. We talked to psychiatrists in and out of Crownsville, and we did a very long series on it. Caused a stir, as one might hope, one might expect. And the state legislative committee did a report that basically confirmed what we had found. And that was it. While the series was running, I was contacted by a woman who said she was a former patient there and had been raped. But she was so scared that if she brought her allegations to the notice of law enforcement authorities, that she would somehow be sent back to Crownsville. And in fact, in the 12 months before I was at Crownsville, there had been 72 deaths out of a population of less than 700, 1 in 10, which I think is very high. There was, in the 18 months or so before I got there was a 26-year-old man who was thrown into seclusion room with only his underpants. He ripped them into strips, tied the end to the grate of the window, and hung himself. There was a woman who was admitted, given drugs immediately, as I was, and shortly thereafter was taken to Anne Arundel General Hospital and died from a drug overdose. There was a 15-year-old boy in the youth wing who was disruptive and was locked into a closet by one of the aides and forgotten. He managed to start a fire. When the attendants noticed the smoke coming out, they didn't have the key to the door. The boy died. So, and those were cases that we found out about and were able to document and knew about. We don't know how many of the other 72 cases involved some aspect of neglect or worse. So there were nasty things that happened. I feel that I did my job as a journalist. I felt some pride in that. The series won some awards. I think as a journalist, all we can do is try our best to expose in the most vivid way possible all of the dark corners of society and hope that prompts the public and responsible officials to take the right actions. I'm not sure that it did in this case. So my sense was somewhat of disappointment. But I felt that I did my job.
There was one superintendent that was hired by the Department of Health and Hygiene that came to the hospital, and they found out at a later date that he had no credentials to back up the position that he had been hired for. But I thought he was the best. because he came in, he listened to what employees had to say, and he proceeded to make changes. Because you had people put in supervised positions, because if you were in a clique, you could have been dumb as a crab, but if you was in that clique, you got that position. He may not have been qualified, but the people liked him. And then a lot of the nurses were trying to get next to him because he was a nice looking man,
They were telling us that it was a new superintendent named Anasari, and he came through. I was working in the staffing center at the time, and he came and met, introduced himself, and we met him, and he was good. From what I remember, later they said, he was, he wasn't for real.
I thought that he had some problems, but I didn't know exactly what it was, and but he had, I saw him like really upset in meetings, and I could not understand what was the reason for him to be that upset, because there was nothing that big, and he had people that were favorites for him and people that he didn't like, and those people, they have to be completely 100% perfect, because anything that they did, he will jump out of the blue.
I can remember there was somebody in the psychology department. He wasn't a psychologist, I don't believe, but he was really after that particular person who had been there for a good long while, did a good job. He was after, I believe, the maintenance supervisor at the time, and he just harassed them terribly. He just harassed, it was constant. I remember that.
I know the head superintendent of Springfield at the time, I think he's passed away, and another one from Spring Grove. And they all come walking in, and he's taken for a tour of this new gym he just put in the patient's room. And I look at it, and there's nobody that knows how to use it. They're all Nautilus. So one of my friends is the deputy director of the Department of Health, and I called him up. I said, Dick, that's a bit strange. I mean, as a lawyer, as a private lawyer, knowing workman's comp issues, you put something in there where somebody could get hurt, and you have nobody trained to do it. It doesn't make sense to me why this guy's suing. He says, I'll look into it.
One of the other things that he did was he was looking for staff that might be sleeping at night, and we would meet at the hospital at around 2:30 in the morning, and make a plan. These are the buildings, the 2x2s. We would go out and go into the buildings to see if you could catch people sleeping. The next thing that I knew was that, he had been relieved of his duties, and my boss had been told to stay there that evening and get the keys from the car from him and that kind of thing. So that's what I remember. And I remember that the next day the maintenance department had a party with a cake and everything to celebrate the fact that he was gone. How he did it, I don't know, because as I understand it, when you went back and looked at the resume, the years didn't jive. It wouldn't have added up to his age or anything. How it got past people, I don't know.
Well, 3 weeks later, I read in the paper, they found out the guy was 12 when he got his medical degree, according to his resume.
Mr. Stevens, this is Victor Moldavay, and I represent Haroon. Please call me back at 404-443-5708. I understand that you showed up at his office, apparently, and he's asking you not to be there. So we're instructing you to leave. If you want to call me back and talk about that, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
There was a general feeling at the time of the closing, even 2 years before it, that one of the state hospitals would close. Crownsville pretty much had been identified for a long time as a place to close. The city of Annapolis has never easily tolerated Crownsville because there's shame about the African American history, there's shame about serious mental illness.
It didn't just come suddenly. They've been talking about closing Crownsville even when I was there. The legislature every year talked about closing Crownsville, or whatever reason, they always had to close the state, one of the state hospitals, whatever. And it never occurred while I was there, and it happened, so it was not a surprise to me.
So pretty much the number of court-ordered patients kept going up, and the number of civilly committed patients kept going down. So what you were left with was about 1,200 beds, and that included both adult and adolescents. So they had to make a decision sooner or later. And Crownsville was operating less units and had less staff than the other two hospitals. So economically and in disruption to patient care and to staff, it was just easier to close Crownsville. 5 wards went to Spring Grove, including the adolescent unit, and 4 wards, continuing care wards, went out to Springfield.
When I was there, it was still so far off in the future. Like when I left in 2003, I mean, we were still a bustling, successful hospital. I mean, full beds and, all the units, all the cottages. And then, 2004, bam. The cottages, it is kind of sad that those closed. Because this, people lived. People who weren't healthy enough to live on the street. It's kind of like when they closed all the state hospitals in the 60s, and that's all the homeless. Again, where did those people go? If there wasn't a spot for them at one of the cottages at Spring Grove or Springfield, did they go home to families? The families probably didn't want them. Families probably took them, and then, out to the streets they went.
It was very sad when they decided to close the hospital, having to tell the patients. Some of the patients had spent most of their adult lives there. That was sad, and then not knowing. They had a meeting, I remember, I think it was maybe on Valentine's Day, where we were all brought into this, we were all told that it was going to close, and then we were given a letter. And this letter said if you were going to retain your job, and if you were, you would either go to Spring Grove or Springfield, and if you weren't going to retain your job. Their goal was to keep all of the clinical staff, but things like maintenance, housekeeping, ancillary staff of that nature, some of those people lost their jobs. And of course that was very sad, as many of them had been working there for their lives.
There was a lot of packing things up and then tying things up, loose ends with patients, saying goodbye. Sometimes we didn't get to say goodbye. And it's nice to be able to terminate a relationship. That's what they call in therapy speak. It's closing the relationship down and saying goodbye and making sure people are going to get what they need wherever they're going to go, that type of thing. Sometimes we didn't get to do that. Right at the very end, people were just gone. They were loaded up and gone.
I think it was a travesty for Southern Maryland that the hospital was closed, because it meant that any patients from down here had to be transported to Baltimore or to Sykesville for care. It meant that families could not go to see them as easily as they did, and it took an extremely historical facility and kicked it to the curb and said, your history doesn't count anymore.
What we'd like to do is present to you tonight the proposal that we have been working on and refining for over 5 years.
The idea behind our plan is to take the 65 to 66 existing buildings on the 500 plus acres and simply renovate them to leasable space that would go to entities primarily dedicated to helping other human beings. In a sense, we're calling this the altruistic economic cluster. What we hope to do is create memorials, create walking tours, essentially let people know what the history of Crownsville is and try to educate as many people as we can about this period in not just Anne Arundel County's history, but this is how it was in the U.S. During the times that this was open. Community Services Center at Crownsville Incorporated will not actually be the tenants in these buildings. We are simply the vehicles to allow these organizations to come and be a part of what it is that we're trying to do. The request for the proposal for the Crownsville State Hospital surplus property is still open in the state's mind. But what would likely happen is they would have to close the current RFP and open up another one, which takes quite a bit of time.
What this bill simply does is set up a task force with the state and with the county. It has the endorsement of the county executive. Hopefully we can get the endorsement of the state. Set up a task force to finally come to some final understanding on what we're going to do with this property.
From the state's perspective, let me just reiterate 12 or 14 years ago, it was made very clear to DHMH and the state to dispose of it, for the closure of Crownsville and disposal of the property would be to the county. So I would prefer us just to be silent in regards to a state report. It's always subject to county zoning in any jurisdiction.
This is, as much as a challenge, it is also an opportunity, and one that I don't feel that the county should waste. Whatever ends up happening on Crownsville Hospital Center, I think that it needs to demonstrate some public use or some benefit to the county. I don't know what that is. I'm not even sure what that would look like, but I can tell you developing it into a bunch of McMansions is not something I would consider would be beneficial to anybody.
not able to cope with the rising tide of addiction in this county. And that's why the opening of this facility is so important. This facility will provide stabilization services, counseling, inpatient services, and other services that are the foundation of effective treatment in Anne Arundel County and elsewhere.
Also, I'm very excited because hopefully this is the start of breathing new life into the Crownsville campus. We've been talking and thinking and trying to find ways to get groups to take advantage of the 500-acre campus that's here, and hopefully this is the beginning of a long string of other groups and other uses that we can make here on this campus. And so thank you for that also.
We pray, Lord, for the souls of those that have been buried here, that they will have that eternal rest that you granted unto them, that they will also realize that they are loving and caring people who wants to make sure that the place in which they have been laid is a place that will be kept up with dignity. Force. Give me one word that describes this day for you. Fun, humbling, blessed, grateful. One word. Anyone else? United. Connected. Unified. Positive. Christ-like. All of those excellent words that describe an excellent event.
I don't even know where to begin. Okay. All right. Okay. All right, sweetheart. My entire family, except for one brother, worked here at Crownsville. My mother retired from here. She worked in the employees' cafeteria and loved everybody that she served. My brother worked in the main kitchen, and he left us in 1975 from a car accident. And my cousin, Pearl Rose Holland Ford, I'm sure a lot of you remember, she just passed away this year. So these are the people that I dedicate my stones to.
Say my name. William Coleman. Say I was here. Anna Jackson. Say my name.
Sophie Griffith.
I am here. Say my name. I am here. Say my name. I am here.
In all of the names that we just said, we release these rose petals because now we know that they are here. Amen.
Amen.
Good job. Hey, Miles. Hey, good job. Way to recognize. Way to recognize. Hey.
When you have vacant buildings like that, after 12 months, they start deteriorating so much inside that it would be extremely costly to put those buildings back online. So I don't think it will ever be used as a psychiatric hospital. You know, what do you do with those buildings? They're just going to continue to deteriorate. So, I mean, it's a nice piece of land.
The movie Crazy 8 was filmed there.
What is this place?
I've never seen it, but I think it was about some kind of a bizarre thing.
Where are we gonna go? What the fuck are we gonna do? I don't even know what's real anymore, do you?
I think it was actually filmed in the basement of the administration building.
But there's some prime real estate there, and I would hate to see it just, turned over to a developer, somebody who's just going to profit off it. I think, there's some real nice woods there, and there's, some real nice property there, and I think it should continue to be used by the people of this state and this community. I think it should be repurposed either into recreational facilities or just more community services.
There are a lot of homeless people that have mental issues, and to have those buildings up there just further deteriorating, it could be set up where it's that these people sleep under the bridges or just walking the streets, hungry, nowhere to stay, will have somewhere to stay.
They talked about making an office building, turning it into like a shopping area. They talked about using it as a horse farm to train horses. They talked about making senior citizen buildings.
They didn't have to open all the buildings, but if they had one building with an up-to-date medical staff, an up-to-date psychiatric thinking, they probably would serve the community very well.
They should dig a giant hole in the middle, tear everything down, and put it in that hole, and put a fence 25 yards away from the hole, all the way around it, and grow marijuana and make hemp paper out of it.
Well, the big problem is, the asbestos. They can't tear the buildings down. Well, they can, but it would cost more to tear them down than it would to just keep them in there. And I think, well, I'm 72. When I'm gone, it'll still be there.
The rehab potential that place has there is unreal. Whether it's emotional rehabilitation for vets that have come back from war, whether it's, drug addiction, whatever it is, that plot of land there has so much potential. There's a lot of people in this world that have been forgotten and that don't have families, that don't have people to step up and take care of them. And so they're out on the street and they're being ignored and abused. And they could be somewhere like that being taken care of. Our society has failed. We're going right back, we're going backwards, not forwards, in taking care of people that can't take care of themselves.
Yeah, my understanding, they have to be really careful about bringing backhoes and stuff in there, because back in the day when it was, the hospital for the Negro insane, someone died, you just chucked them outside. You didn't give them a proper burial. And so my understanding is they've done, they've dug and stuff, doing like power lines and stuff, and they found like unmarked graves. They found bodies and stuff out there. And, so you gotta be careful, not to run someone's, great Uncle Bob over,
The place is still there. And that could be a model. That could be something that brings races together with love and compassion and understanding. It could be the greatest movement in the state of Maryland in the history of our state. Because what? This is a land put aside for the mentally insane.
I go on the Crownsville grounds, and I find a spot, and I plant my angel and chimes on a stake into the ground. And I might plant them underneath a tree. I might plant them in the corner of two buildings that might be adjoining each other. Just plant them wherever I can and however long time I have there until the squad car comes along, and they always do. It's just kind of like a silly thing that I do. It's like my way of saying I'm sorry. It's also in honor of these patients because these patients, they were precious souls. Their hearts were magnificent.
A guy said to me one time, he said, George, what color is love? And I said, no one really knows, but if you ask my opinion, I should refer you to the almighty doctor, who in his infinite divine wisdom took some peace, understanding, tolerance, forgiveness, added a cup of joy and a glass of tears, mixed it to perfection to sprinkle it with stardust and called it love and prescribed it to lonely hearts. Yet love is but a dream. So my honey, dedicate this verse to you, often when I'm deep in slumber. I dream of things so strange it seems, that I'm a prince and you're my princess, or I'm a king and you're my queen. Deep in my imagination, I'm a savage and you're my mate, bound by God's eternal graces, which even death can't separate. Look for you but find you gone. Yes, with all my imagination, I'm still quite alone. That's only, I'm frightened. With my thoughts and scattered schemes, I wonder what will happen to me when I grow too old to dream. That's what I think and that's what I feel.